In the winter skies over Central Europe, the clouds gathered like a permanent fortress, a shifting gray barricade that stretched from horizon to horizon, a natural shield forged not from steel or concrete, but from fog, rain, and endless layers of thick, moisture-laden air. For years, this shield had guarded the industrial heart of Germany. It had hidden the factories of the Ruhr, the refineries of Leuna, the chemical complexes of Merseburg, and the sprawling Farben plants that fed the German war machine. When Allied bombers approached these regions, the clouds swallowed them whole, turning precision missions into blind searches and forcing pilots to abandon runs or drop bombs into nothingness. German officers had come to rely on this weather more than any flak gun, more than any fighter squadron, more than any deception plan, because no human force could predict or penetrate the sky when it turned opaque above Europe. The cloud cover behaved like a living creature, sometimes drifting slowly, sometimes thickening into walls of white that stretched for hundreds of miles. Bomber crews described it as flying into a void, a world without horizon or shadow, where the only reference was the dim glow of instruments inside their own aircraft. The Ruhr Valley, in particular, seemed wrapped in these clouds for much of the year, a blanket of industrial haze mixed with natural fog. It was the workshop of the Reich, built on coal, steel, and chemical production, and the weather shield protected it with relentless loyalty. Even the most determined American bomber formations struggled against the sky itself, navigating through the turbulence only to find the target obscured once more. Below the clouds, hidden rail yards and factories continued to operate. Train lines carried coal and finished goods. Refineries processed synthetic fuel. Chemical plants churned out explosives, rubber, and lubricants. And the Luftwaffe stayed alive through petroleum distilled from plants the Allies could not reach. Above the clouds, German workers felt almost untouchable. They knew the threat of bombers was real. They had endured raids, but they also knew that the clouds often saved them when the sirens wailed. People glanced upward, saw nothing, and allowed themselves a sliver of relief. Because if the clouds stayed thick, the bombs would fall scattered across fields instead of factories. The belief became a kind of superstition. The weather shield was the guardian of the fatherland. American commanders understood the challenge. Every operation briefing from 1943 onward contained the same warning: cloud cover over target area expected. Bomber groups launched from England in skies that looked deceptively clear, only to meet walls of gray high above the Rhine or Berlin. Even after hours of flight, everything depended on a single question: could they see the target? If the answer was no, entire missions ended in frustration. The bombs released through openings in the clouds hit nowhere near the complexes. The war planners called this scattered bombing. The crews called it blind grief. But the German industrial managers quietly celebrated each failed strike because every day their plant survived. The war effort continued. Fuel was produced, trucks rolled out, aircraft engines were machined, and the Reich held together under the shelter of the sky. The limitations of visual bombing shaped every aspect of Allied strategy. Commanders knew that the Luftwaffe could recover as long as synthetic oil at Leuna and Merseburg remained untouched, and both sat beneath what pilots called the eternal cloud belt. From autumn through spring, the region almost never cleared. Weather reports from Pathfinder squadrons read the same again and again: target obscured by complete overcast, return to base, no strike results. For the men of the 8th Air Force, morale suffered. They flew long, dangerous missions through flak and fighters only to turn back empty-handed or drop bombs on secondary targets of little importance. Losses mounted, success remained elusive, and German industry kept running. The frustration grew in every briefing room, in every navigation section, and in every intelligence report. Something had to change. Because the war could not be won if the sky was allowed to protect the factories feeding the enemy. In Washington and in the laboratories of MIT, scientists understood the problem better than anyone. They knew that the bomber was not enough. The bomb sight was not enough. The human eye was not enough. The only solution was to give aircraft a new kind of vision, not dependent on sunlight or shadows or open skies, a vision that could pierce the weather itself. For months, engineers worked with quiet urgency, testing frequencies, calibrating antennas, building prototypes inside the radiation laboratory. They believed that radar could be used not only for navigation and interception, but for bombing itself. If a radar could read the shape of a coastline, maybe it could read the shape of a city. If it could track a ship, maybe it could track a factory silhouette under cloud cover. The idea was radical, the application uncertain. But the war demanded answers, and the demand grew louder with each failed raid. Eventually, the scientists produced a device, small enough to fit into a bomber, powerful enough to detect ground features, and precise enough to guide a bomb run even when the pilot could not see more than a few meters ahead. This machine would become known as H2X, a radar operating in the X-band capable of painting ghostly but recognizable images of terrain on a circular screen. The bombers would fly not by sight, but by signal, not by sunlight, but by reflection, not by maps, but by electronic echoes. And if H2X worked, the clouds that had guarded the Ruhr and Berlin for years would become meaningless. The first crews chosen to test the device were skeptical. Radar inside a bomber seemed almost like witchcraft. But when they switched it on during a training flight, the screen lit up, revealing coastlines, rivers, and large cities as glowing shapes, even through thick cloud layers. The radar saw it all. And in that moment, a realization swept through the cabin. The cloud shield was about to break. The bombers would no longer turn back, no longer scatter bombs blindly, no longer wait for clear skies. The sky itself would no longer matter. And for the first time, the German industrial fortress built beneath the clouds felt vulnerable. The era of radar bombing had begun, and the weather that once protected a nation would soon offer it no shelter at all. The arrival of H2X on British airfields did not look like the arrival of a weapon that would alter the war. No sirens, no fanfare, no officers gathered in ceremony. Instead, a small team of American technicians rolled out a crate marked with simple stencils, a square metal housing, cables, an odd rotating dish, and a set of manuals thicker than a pilot training binder. It looked almost unimpressive sitting on the concrete beside the massive bombers. Yet inside that unremarkable equipment lay a revolution. A radar that would let American crews see the ground even when Europe hid beneath a ceiling of clouds, snow, and industrial haze. The airmen gathered around it were skeptical. They had flown too many missions swallowed by weather, pored over too many failed mission reports, and listened to too many briefings that ended with the same bitter words, "Mission abandoned due to overcast." To them, the sky had become the real enemy. Not the Luftwaffe, not the flak batteries, but the clouds that clung stubbornly to the Ruhr, Berlin, Merseburg, and the entire industrial spine of Germany. That shield of vapor had defeated more American raids than any fighter squadron ever had. So when the technicians began explaining how H2X worked, many of the pilots and navigators folded their arms and exchanged doubtful looks. The device would emit pulses of energy. These pulses would bounce off the ground, even through clouds, and the reflections would appear on a circular screen as bright or dark patches. Rivers, cities, factories, and rail yards would take shape as ghostly radar shadows. The navigator would read the radar screen, just as he read a map, and the bombardier would release the bombs based on the glowing outlines instead of using his eyes. It sounded like magic. But the war had already shown that magic could be made by scientists who refused to accept limitations. After the short lecture, the technicians installed H2X on one of the Pathfinder aircraft, a specially modified B-17 fitted with additional navigation equipment, heavy wiring, and a console where the radar operator sat. The rest of the crew climbed aboard, watching with curiosity as the system powered up for the first time. Inside the bomber, the screen sprang to life, a circular scope glowing green in the darkened cabin. At first, the image flickered. then slowly stabilized, forming hazy but distinct patterns. As the aircraft rose into a training flight above the storm clouds that blanketed the English countryside, the pilot flew straight into the overcast sky. The world outside vanished, swallowed in a cold gray void. The cockpit windows showed nothing but shifting mist, and the instruments trembled from turbulence. But in the navigation cabin, the radar operator leaned over his glowing scope and smiled. He pointed to a curved line glowing gently along the perimeter of the display. "That is the coast," he said, and the navigator stared in disbelief. The coastline was invisible through the clouds, but perfectly visible on the radar screen. H2X was reading the difference in ground reflection between land and sea, creating a silhouette that no bomber crew had ever been able to see from inside a cloud. Then more shapes emerged. Faint islands outlined by reflection differences, patches of light showing cities, dark zones showing forest or water, a network of dots marking rail yards and industrial zones. As the bomber turned inland, the radar image shifted, revealing the unmistakable jagged edge of a major urban center. Even through complete overcast, the crew gasped. It was London glowing on the radar scope like a ghostly constellation, invisible to the eye, but clear to the machine. The pilot flew deeper into the clouds on purpose, testing the system. The bombardier entered the cabin, staring at the display, unable to believe that he could now aim bombs without ever seeing the target. He had spent his career dependent on visibility. Now, visibility no longer mattered. When the bomber returned to base, the briefing room filled with excitement that had not existed for months. Suddenly, the war felt solvable. The eternal frustration of blind bombing lifted. The crew felt as though they had been given a new sense, a new form of sight that worked even when nature took everything else away. The commanders took note. The Pathfinder squadrons would be equipped with H2X immediately, and soon entire bomber streams could be guided into enemy territory, even in total cloud cover. The H2X units were installed into lead aircraft one by one, each dish carefully tuned, each operator trained in the peculiar art of reading glowing shapes on a screen and deciding where the bomb line would be drawn. The Germans had long believed that weather would save them. Every intelligence report emphasized the same truth. The Allies cannot hit factories in the Ruhr during the winter. The clouds protect everything. But that belief was about to shatter. The first combat test of H2X came during a mission over the Ruhr Valley, an area pilots called the Black Pit, because no matter the season, the region seemed to drown itself in fog, smoke, and industrial haze. The bombers took off into a thick morning overcast, climbing through sheets of moisture, their wings icing, their engines growling against the cold. At 20,000 feet, the world outside remained a blank white void. Flak guns below fired blindly, guided only by sound and guesswork. But the Pathfinder crew had no uncertainty. The radar scope lit up again, faint patterns forming beneath them, the Ruhr River winding like a glowing thread, factories appearing as bright clusters, the synthetic oil facility at Leuna rising on the scope like a dark geometric monolith. Clouds meant nothing now. The pilot flew as if the sky were clear. The bombardier synchronized the crosshair with radar readings, and the lead bomber dropped its load. The formation behind released their bombs in disciplined sequence, letting hundreds of explosive charges fall through the clouds, guided by nothing but the radar image below. On that day, the Germans in the valley looked upward, expecting cloud cover to save them again. But the bombs fell accurately, crushing rail lines, ripping apart processing towers, igniting tanks of synthetic fuel, and sending pillars of smoke curling into the same clouds that had once protected them. Back in England, the commanders stared at the mission results. For years, the Ruhr had been nearly invincible, except on rare, clear days. Now a strike force had hit it through complete overcast, and hit it well. It was the moment the weather shield cracked forever. From then on, H2X Pathfinders became the spearhead of every major strategic bombing mission. No more canceled operations, no more wasted sorties, no more turning back over the channel. The bombers now possessed a new eye, an electronic eye that saw through weather, darkness, and deception. And with each new raid, Germany's industrial heart began to tremble. The Reich had never feared technology as much as it did now, because the sky had turned against them, and the clouds no longer offered shelter. The first true test of H2X came not in training skies over England, but in the thick, brutal overcast that had shielded the German heartland for years. When the bomber stream crossed the Dutch coastline on a cold gray morning in early 1944, the crews felt that familiar sense of futility. Clouds stretched from horizon to horizon. The sun was a pale smear above them, the world below completely erased in white. Yet this time there was no tension in the cockpit, no desperate hoping for sudden clear patches, no nervous glances between pilot and bombardier. They had H2X glowing steadily in the navigation cabin, a quiet, unblinking eye ready to pierce the void. The Pathfinder B-17 held the lead position, its radar operator huddled over the round screen, adjusting gain and range knobs with delicate precision. Static flickered, shapes pulsed, and then slowly a pattern emerged, faint at first, like a fingerprint pressed into fog, but growing sharper with each sweep. Roads, rail lines, rivers, and clusters of industrial buildings appeared as bright contrasts against the darker landscape. The bombardier leaned over the operator's shoulder, his breath slow, controlled. This was the moment that would decide whether radar bombing was a miracle or a myth. The German industrial city of Essen lay ahead, hidden beneath a lid of clouds so thick that even flak bursts would disappear into it. The Krupp Steelworks, one of the most vital industrial complexes in Europe, had survived countless raids in 1943 because weather spared it more often than guns or fighters did. But now, the glowing radar silhouette on the H2X screen outlined its presence unmistakably. A large, bright cluster surrounded by darker areas, the city's signature shape. The bombardier set his tables, aligned the image, and waited for the release point. The pilot flew steady, trusting the radar operator rather than his own eyes. The formation followed behind, engines roaring in synchronized rhythm, invisible to the land below, but guided by the electronic ghost map on the Pathfinder's screen. The first bombs dropped, falling through miles of cloud, silent until the moment they broke through and crashed into steel furnaces, machine shops, and rail yards. Germans on the ground ran outside, hearing explosions but seeing nothing falling from above. The sky looked unchanged, but destruction rained from it. Essen burned that day, not because the clouds parted, but because the Allies no longer needed the sky to clear. For the first time, the shield of weather cracked, and once it cracked, it shattered. H2X Pathfinders soon led raids against Bochum, Dortmund, Duisburg, and above all, the Leuna synthetic oil complex at Merseburg, the largest producer of synthetic fuel in the Reich, a target so critical that Hitler called it the beating heart of German mobility. Before H2X, the Allies had attacked Leuna repeatedly and failed. Clouds intervened every time, bombs fell wide, repair crews restored operations, and the plant kept producing petroleum essential for the Luftwaffe, tanks, trucks, and U-boats. But now, as the bombers crossed into Germany at high altitude through an ocean of cloud, H2X cut through the gray like a scalpel. The radar operator saw Leuna long before the men on the ground saw the bombers. The distinct geometric patterns of its refining units, storage tanks, and chemical towers stood out clearly on the glowing screen. The Pathfinder operator whispered confirmation to the bombardier, his hand steady. The pilot kept formation, the sky a blank, empty whiteness, but the radar room alive with electronic images. Then the command came, bombs away. Hundreds of bombs plummeted through the cloud cover, striking the refining towers with devastating precision. Flames erupted, columns of smoke rose straight into the cloud base, turning the sky darker than night. Leuna took catastrophic damage that day, and when German engineers assessed the ruins, they realized with horror that the raid should have been impossible. The weather had been perfect for defense, total overcast, a fortress of fog, yet the fortress had been breached. The message spread rapidly. Through German intelligence reports, weather no longer protects our factories. H2X did not only crack the shield, it shattered a strategic assumption on which the Reich had depended. Entire regions had been considered safe because of climate. Ruhr haze, industrial smog, Berlin winter fog, Merseburg cloud belts, all of them had been declared natural allies of German survival. But H2X saw through all of it. The next phase of operations intensified. Pathfinders guided night and day raids through conditions that would once have grounded entire air fleets. Mission after mission targeted strategic assets with relentless accuracy, even when the crews on board never glimpsed the ground. The weather shield that had protected the Reich for years collapsed completely. Its failure felt most violently by the synthetic oil industry. The Luftwaffe relied on synthetic fuel factories at Leuna, Politz, Bolin, and Ruhland, every one of which sat inside cloud-heavy regions, the same regions now mapped clearly by H2X radar. The 8th Air Force attacked Politz through a storm that grounded German fighters. The refinery was hit so hard that output dropped to near zero within weeks. The damage to German fuel reserves was irreversible. Panzer divisions rationed fuel, fighter wings operated at a fraction of their capacity, and the once mobile German army became chained to static defenses. Germany's industrial spine, squeezed by constant radar-guided bombardment, cracked under the pressure. As bombs continued to fall unseen, factories that had operated in safety for 4 years suddenly faced a new terrifying reality. No matter what the weather, the bombers would come. Rain, snow, fog, wind, none of it mattered any longer. The last belief that protected German industry dissolved in the cold white glare of clouds penetrated by radar. Engineers at IG Farben and the Luftwaffe Ministry wrote desperate memoranda noting that the Americans now attack with full precision even in complete cloud cover. H2X had ended the era of weather-protected war. The shield had broken, and Germany's industrial heart began to collapse under a relentless rain of bombs guided by an eye that no storm could blind. An eye that saw through cloud, smoke, deception, and darkness, and never stopped watching. As long as the bombers kept flying, the weather would never again save the Reich.
By the summer of 1944, the skies over Germany no longer obeyed the seasons. Clouds still gathered, storms still rolled across the landscape, fog still clung to the valleys of the Ruhr in the synthetic oil region of central Germany, but none of it mattered anymore. The weather that had once guarded the industrial heart of the Reich had been stripped of all power. The arrival of H2X turned every overcast day into a bombing day, every storm front into a mere inconvenience, and every thick cloud bank into nothing more than a thin veil over targets that were now illuminated by radar. The transformation was immediate and brutal. With each new radar-guided raid, German industry stumbled closer to collapse. The first sector to buckle was synthetic fuel, the lifeblood of Hitler's war machine. Germany had few natural oil reserves, so its war effort depended heavily on synthetic fuel created from coal through hydrogenation and Fischer-Tropsch processes. Plants at Leuna, Merseburg, Bolin, Politz, and Ruhland produced the gasoline, diesel, aviation fuel, lubricants, and methanol that powered the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, and the Kriegsmarine. Without these facilities, the Reich could not fight. But these plants also sat in regions famous for permanent cloud cover, locations chosen partly because weather made precision bombing nearly impossible. That advantage ended the moment H2X Pathfinder aircraft began directing strikes through complete overcast. The first catastrophic blow fell on Leuna. The sprawling complex operated by IG Farben covered several square kilometers. A maze of cracking towers, hydrogenation halls, distillation columns, and storage tanks. For years, the plant had escaped decisive damage on days when the bombers reached it at all. The clouds scattered the bombs across farms and forests, leaving the heart of the facility mostly intact. But H2X changed everything. The radar operators saw the distinctive shapes of the chemical towers through the clouds and guided the bombardiers with calm precision. The bombs descended from an invisible sky and tore into the complex with unrelenting accuracy. Workers on the ground watched in horror as explosions rippled through the most vital structures, Steam columns burst into the air, chemical fires burned for days, and repair crews found themselves overwhelmed. Leuna staggered, but still stood. The 8th Air Force returned again, guided once more by radar, and again clouds offered no protection. The second raid hit the areas spared by the first. The third raid crushed the hydrogenation chambers. The fourth raid annihilated the power plant that kept the facility alive. By now, the German high command realized something terrifying. The Americans did not need clear skies anymore. They would come again, and again, and again, until there was nothing left. The Leuna complex never recovered. Within months, its output fell to less than 10% of pre-war capacity. The Luftwaffe felt the strain almost immediately. Fighter groups grounded, missions canceled, panzer divisions rationed fuel, supply lines dried up, entire operations stalled simply because there was not enough gasoline to move vehicles along the front. The collapse of fuel cascaded into every corner of the military. By late 1944, some panzer divisions received only enough fuel to move a few kilometers per day, not to fight, only to exist. And even that supply shrank as H2X bombing intensified. While fuel production cratered, the American bomber stream shifted to attack another vital artery, the German rail network. Germany relied heavily on trains to move coal, fuel, troops, and anything required by the war economy. The rail centers at Hanover, Bremen, Nuremberg, Munich, Dresden, and especially the Ruhr were essential to keeping the industry alive. But every one of these rail hubs lay in regions covered in overcast through most of the year. In the past, when clouds hung low, the rail yards escaped the worst bombings. But with H2X, those same rail yards appeared clearly as bright clusters on radar screens. The operators could see the long lines of tracks, the shapes of freight yards, the reflective surfaces of switching towers, and the outlines of roundhouses and locomotive depots. Thick cloud meant nothing to the radar. The Pathfinder aircraft lined up the radar images with target coordinates, and the bombers behind released wave after wave of destruction. One raid shattered the Ruhr rail hubs, reducing switching yards to tangled scrap. Another raid isolated the city of Leipzig, cutting lines that fed factories on the Eastern Front. A third raid destroyed junctions near Bremen, disrupting coal shipments to the north. As the rail system crumbled, factories could not receive raw materials or ship products. Even plants untouched by bombs suffered production failures because they were starved of coal, chemicals, or machinery spare parts. German managers wrote increasingly desperate reports: lines down, trains halted, traffic jammed, nowhere to send or receive supplies. And looming above it all was the same grim conclusion: the Americans attack in all weather now. The next sector to fall was chemical production. Beyond synthetic oil, Germany depended heavily on chemicals produced by IG Farben, especially rubber, explosives, dye intermediates, and industrial lubricants. The Bühnewerke at Schkopau and the plants at Merseburg were among the most advanced chemical facilities in the world, but they too sat under the same cloud belts that were supposed to protect them. H2X turned those clouds into a perfect cover for Allied aircraft, which could strike without being seen below. Radar-guided bombs tore into chemical towers, ruptured pipelines, ignited storage tanks, and set entire blocks of the plants ablaze. Attempting repairs became impossible because the bombs came back before workers could finish fixing anything. Every morning, thick industrial smoke rose into the already darkened sky, mixing with cloud layers, forming an eerie haze that once would have saved them, but now only made radar readings sharper. The more smoke, the more reflective contrast for the H2X screens. By the autumn of 1944, Germany's chemical sector was crippled. Bühne rubber output nearly stopped, nitrogen production for explosives crashed, methanol and butyl production dropped to a fraction of required amounts, and high-grade lubricants essential for aircraft engines became impossible to produce in adequate quantity. As each sector collapsed, another followed. The rail network slowed, the fuel sector died, The chemical sector faltered, and the entire industrial heart of Germany found itself suffocating under the pressure of constant radar bombing through clouds, storms, and winter weather that should have stopped attacks for months. The 8th Air Force launched missions day after day, radar guiding them straight into the heart of German industry. Even during the darkest parts of the year, when Europe turned into a continent of fog and snow, the raids continued. Through December, through January, through blizzards and freezing fog layers. The sky no longer mattered to the bombers, but it still mattered to the defenders. German flak gunners fired blind, unable to see the bomber stream. German fighters struggled to intercept missions that happened in impossible conditions. The Luftwaffe pilots called it the era of invisible bombers. They launched into storms only to find nothing, then return low on fuel as the bombs fell accurately from unseen aircraft, and everywhere the same refrain was whispered again and again: "The weather betrays us now." Hitler's industrial empire had once drawn strength from European climate. Now that same climate had become irrelevant, and the industries that had supplied the Reich with steel, oil, chemicals, and weapons began to collapse piece by piece under an onslaught directed not by human eyes, but by a radar scope glowing inside a darkened bomber cabin. And as the factories fell and train lines died and storage tanks burned, the Reich lost the ability to wage modern war. The weather shield had not only cracked, it had failed completely. And nothing Germany possessed could restore it.
By early 1945, the war in Europe looked nothing like the world Germany had prepared for. The Reich had built its strategy on assumptions forged from the last war. Assumptions about weather, geography, industrial depth, and the protection offered by Central Europe's climate. For years, German planners believed that the cloud belts over the Ruhr, the fog-heavy plains of central Germany, and the haze over Berlin would shield their factories from precision attack. They believed that technology might help the Allies, but nature would protect them. They believed that no bomber could strike what no pilot could see. But H2X destroyed every one of those assumptions, and the consequences spread through the Reich like fractures in a collapsing dam. At American bomber bases, the crews no longer waited for clear weather windows, no longer postponed raids, no longer wasted precious days staring at gray skies. Radar made every day a strike day, and every target vulnerable. The strategic bombing calendar, which once followed the seasons, now followed only the needs of the war. Factories that had once enjoyed months of protection from winter clouds found no relief. Chemical plants, synthetic oil refineries, ball bearing factories, locomotive works, marshalling yards, aircraft assembly halls, all of them were hit again and again and again. Through storms, through fog, through blizzards, and always with enough accuracy to destroy what mattered most. Germans on the ground began to understand long before High Command admitted it. The weather no longer belonged to them. The mists over the Ruhr had been their comfort, the low stratus clouds over Merseburg their silent defender, the deep winter fog over Berlin their last shield. But the bombers still came, guided by a machine that cared nothing for rain or snow or darkness. The psychological impact was immense. Workers once reassured by bad weather now trembled at the sound of distant engines. They no longer believed the sky could save them, because the bombs fell anyway, even when the sky was a featureless curtain of gray. More than a military collapse, Germany faced the collapse of its faith in the one protector it never had to pay for. The protector that never slept, never ran out of ammunition, and never betrayed it. Until H2X arrived, the radar inside each Pathfinder aircraft became the architect of the Reich's industrial downfall. Each glowing screen wrote another line in Germany's obituary. The synthetic fuel system shattered first, then the rail network, then the chemical industry, then the steelworks, then the remaining aircraft factories. One by one, the pillars of German war production dissolved into rubble under the weight of constant bombardment. And by removing the barrier of weather, the Allies forced the Reich into a war pace it could not survive. German engineers and officers documented the change in increasingly desperate memoranda. The Americans now attack in all conditions, attacks no longer limited by weather. Continuous pressure, unsustainable repair cycles without pause. Production impossible under repeated radar-directed bombing. Reports compiled after the war confirmed what the bomb-damage surveys later called the irreversible collapse of German industry. In truth, the collapse had begun the moment H2X pathfinders started guiding bomber streams through thick cloud, turning the natural world itself into an ally of the United States, while betraying the Germany that once relied upon it. But the significance of H2X extended far beyond the factories it destroyed. It marked a turning point, the dawn of a new kind of warfare, the beginning of the era where information defeated terrain, where sensors defeated weather, and where electronics dictated the shape of battle in ways no general could command without them. The radar that saw through clouds became the ancestor of technologies that would dominate the century. Surface mapping radar for Cold War bombers, terrain-following radar for low-altitude penetration missions, synthetic aperture radar for reconnaissance, and eventually the precision navigation systems that guide modern aircraft across the globe. In the closing months of the war, bomber crews spoke about H2X with a kind of reverence. They had seen how it transformed missions, how it removed the helplessness of flying blind, how it turned guesswork into certainty. Many described it as gaining a second sight, a calm, unblinking clarity that cut through the chaos of winter skies. Veterans later recalled the moment they first trusted the ghostly radar images, the way the rivers lit up, the way cities glowed, the way factories stood out as bright scars on the darkened display. And they remembered how it felt to know that even when they could not see their enemy could no longer hide from them. And in Germany, long after the bombs stopped falling and the radar signals faded into peace, German industrial managers and surviving engineers admitted their astonishment. H2X was the end of our protection, one said. Another concluded that the Americans removed weather from the equation entirely. A third wrote that the collapse of the synthetic fuel system was due not only to bombs, but to the fact that they could strike us every day, rain or snow. It was the first time in history that weather had ceased to matter in strategic bombing, and the last time any nation relied on weather as a barrier in war. When the war finally ended, the radar sets were switched off, the Pathfinder aircraft parked silent along English runways, and the clouds drifted once again across Europe, unchanged but no longer feared. The weather shield was broken, shattered by an electronic eye that saw through mist, darkness, and storms, and in doing so, helped bring an empire to its knees. The H2X radar did not drop bombs, did not fire guns, and did not command fleets, but it made everything else possible. It closed the skies around the Reich, removed the last natural protection Germany possessed, and accelerated the collapse of an industrial machine that at once seemed untouchable. By piercing the clouds, H2X pierced the myth of German invulnerability, and with every radar-guided strike, it brought the war closer to its end. The weather shield was gone, forever, and in its place stood a new truth. In modern war, nothing can hide from the eye that sees through the storm.